Shalom, and welcome to another edition of Kosher Caffeine. Turbocharge your soul right now. I got so many positive emails from my last Kosher Caffeine, Kabbalah and Physics. I'm going to give you another Kosher Caffeine on Kabbalah and Science. The Torah tells us that everything we find here in this world is an expression of God's wisdom. And the deepest aspects of God's wisdom we call Kabbalah, mysticism. So when you know Kabbalah and mysticism, you know then that there's going to be an expression of that wisdom in this world. And when you see this world, then going backwards, you know that there's got to be a discussion on those matters in Kabbalah and mysticism. The two are connected with each other. One is a result of the other. So let's go backwards and let's start from what we find here in this world. When we look at substance, we know substance is made of atoms. An atom has at the core of an atom a nucleus in which there is a neutron and a proton. Then there are regions of space around a nucleus which contains moving electrons. An atom, scientists tell us, can have up to 7 spaces that surround the nucleus in which there is the neutron and the proton. And in these spaces, there is a certain number of electrons in these spaces. It can take up to 2, 8, 18, and 32 electrons respectively. The further away the shell is from the nucleus, the higher the energy of its electrons. And when the spaces are filled with the appropriate electrons, we have what we call a very stable atom. There's so many things to talk about when modern-day scientists have discovered this fact of reality, which is reflected in the principles and in the wisdom of Kabbalah and in the practices of a Jewish person. And as we said in the previous Kosher Caffeine, it's those practices of Judaism that count the most, because the wisdom only keeps it esoteric, ethereal. But the switches that bring the wisdom and bring the energy into our lives are the actual practices and the mitzvahs. What do we find here in the atom? We're saying over here that there is a nucleus surrounded by 7 spaces. Isn't that interesting that the Talmud and the Torah tells us that the world is surrounded by 7 heavens? And as the Rambam Maimonides tells us, those heavens are like the shells in an onion. And these heavens, they are very translucent. You can't even see where one ends and where the next one begins. And isn't it interesting that the furthest heaven is the strongest of all heavens because it's the closest to God. And the core, the center of everything is this world. That's how the Talmud says, that the purpose of everything is this earth and the people that live on it and the good deeds that people do. And another thing we find is that in these spaces, it can hold up to 32 electrons in these what we call spaces that are going around the nucleus. When a person puts on a talit, the talit that a person puts on, the prayer shawl, this represents in mysticism and Kabbalah the force that is encompassing, similar to the spaces that are going around the nucleus. It surrounds the person. It's creating that aura around the person. And another thing that's interesting is that on this prayer shawl, there has to be 32 strings. And mysticism, Kabbalah tells us that when God expresses his wisdom in the world, that's represented in 32 strands of energy. We call those the 32 pathways of wisdom. And they are represented in the 32 strings that we have coming from the prayer shawl. So from this encompassing aura of the prayer shawl comes within it, or out of it, or attached to it, these 32, if we want to call them, electrical impulses. And another thing, our Torah tells us that a man and a woman is more like a positive force and a negative force. Not negative in the sense of bad, but positive and negative in the sense of electricity. When a man and woman get married, the tradition is that the woman goes around the man 7 times, similar to the 7 spaces that the electron travels around the core, which is the nucleus, and which is the proton, which is the man. And we could go on and find so many similarities in this fact of reality when we're talking about an atom and the talit and the 32 strings and the woman that goes around the man, and the fact that an atom, for it to be stable, it must have both a proton and a electron. It must have the positive and the negative, the man and the woman. Two women, if it's all electrons, two men, if it's all protons, it's not going to make for a stable atom. And of course, you always have to have the third element, and that's what stabilizes everything, and that's God himself. As the Torah tells us that when a man and woman invite godliness into their relationship, they are committed to the practices of the Jewish family purity that sticks the marriage together. It gives a goal that is greater than the two together, and therefore it encompasses and it sticks and it glues them together. That is when there is the blessing between them. So until next time, we talk about the great wisdom of the sages, and that the practices of Judaism that represent modern day science, and that through the wisdom of Kabbalah we can appreciate how deep and how valuable those practices are. Adios. Do another mitzvah, you'll be creating another field of energy, of blessings and of kindness.